2012. The Olympic Games had come to Britain, and the eyes of the world were eagerly trained on the capital's new Olympic Park.
The opening ceremony was billed as a showcase for the very best of British. There was only one small problem though. Nobody really knew what that meant. A century and a half earlier, at the height of our power and prestige, we'd put on the Great Exhibition of 1851, a celebration of our manufacturing might. In Hyde Park, the Victorians built a vast glass and steel structure, the Crystal Palace, and filled it with the glories of British industry. But by 2012, much of our industrial base was gone. So what did we have left to boast about?
The opening ceremony threatened to be a fiasco, played out on a global stage. But it wasn't. Instead, it was a celebration of Britain like never before. And the reason?
We may have lost our colonial empire and our industrial supremacy, but there is one thing, I think, that we do better than anyone else on the planet. Popular culture.
And that is precisely what the opening ceremony celebrated. It's extraordinary to think that one British writer, J.K. Rowling, has sold more than 400 million books. That Doctor Who is watched in almost every country in the Western world. That James Bond has been the central character in the longest-running film series in history. That the Beatles are still the best-selling musical group of all time. And that only Shakespeare and the Bible have sold more books than Agatha Christie.
To put it simply, no other country on earth, relative to its size, has contributed more to the modern imagination. This is the story of how we went from being a country that made things to a country that makes culture, and from an empire that spanned a quarter of the globe to an empire of the imagination.
So, British culture, where do you start? What about with a group of lads from Birmingham who decided that their lives should be different? The future laid out for them was one of hard labour and industrial grit, a life in the steelworks. Since Victorian times, Birmingham had been the beating heart of British industry. Its products bought and sold all over the world. But by the late 1960s, life for these lads was looking a lot bleaker.
The iron trade is a dying industry. It's dying out. The lads leaving school now, they won't entertain it, they won't have it.
Nowhere suffered more from the brutal collapse of British manufacturing than the West Midlands. But out of the ashes of our industrial heritage, there emerged something entirely new. Because in the late 1960s, Birmingham began to forge a very different kind of metal.
In 1965, the 17-year-old Tony Iommi was working his last day at the local steelworks.
A keen amateur guitarist, he had decided to give up manual labour for a life in music. But as he was loading a sheet of metal into the steel press, the momentarily lost concentration, and in that instant he brought the full weight of the industrial machinery down on the middle two fingers of his right hand.
For Aomi, it was a disaster. He was left-handed and he just severed two of his fretting fingers. Undeterred, he made his own leather thimbles and played on. It was a moment that changed the future of popular music.
What is this that stands before me?
Because Aomi became the lead guitarist of Black Sabbath.
Like the other members of Black Sabbath, and I suspect most youngsters in the West Midlands, Tony Iommi felt little affinity with the hippie-ish, peace and love, flower power side of the 1960s. He had grown up in a world of blast furnaces and steam hammers. Heavy metal was quite literally in the air. What he wanted was to make music that reflected his daily reality, the din and the sweat and the grit of life in industrial Birmingham, the workshop of the world.
With its roots in the forges and foundries of our industrial past, Black Sabbath pioneered a louder, deeper, heavier sound. They would prove irresistibly influential. From Motorhead to Metallica, heavy metal has become a global musical phenomenon, thrilling audiences around the world, from Solihull to Shanghai.
Really enjoy it and forget about the rest of your troubles and that. It just gets you going, really. I mean, you start headbanging and you're feeling okay.
In a 2011 census, more than 6,000 people even listed it as their religion. Black Sabbath's blend of industrial clamour and satanic fantasy has seen the band sell some 70 million records worldwide. Their most recent album went to number 1 in 14 countries.
Heavy metal could only have been born in Britain. It came screaming and shrieking out of a place that for more than a century had rung to the din of iron and steel. The great irony, though, is that Black Sabbath came banging and crashing onto the scene at the very moment when the great forges and foundries were beginning to close their doors. And perhaps that is no coincidence.
It was only as Britain's industrial, political and military power started to wane that we began to see ourselves as entertainers to the world. Yet much of our popular culture represents a reckoning with the industrial and imperial greatness that we had and we lost. The story of our culture, like the Industrial Revolution, is one of different parts of our country specialising in different kinds of products. And at its heart is exactly the same spirit of invention and entrepreneurship.
It's that same spirit that drove men like Matthew Boulton and James Watt, the pioneers whose steam engine transformed their age. These industrial revolutionaries, as well as their Victorian successors, lived in a world of innovation, marketing and money. I don't think we've ever really lost that ethos, that creative, entrepreneurial instinct. And in that sense, perhaps, we all still live in Victorian Britain.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What? What? Ask for more?
If you look and listen hard enough, you begin to hear the ghosts of our Victorian past echoing through our popular culture. And often, that's been down to the outlook of the individuals who shaped it, or perhaps more accurately, manufactured it.
Today, most of us associate the name J. Arthur Rank with black and white films on wet Sunday afternoons. But you know, Rank wasn't actually a filmmaker. He was, in fact, a miller. But in the 1930s and 1940s, it was this unassuming Yorkshire miller who became the saviour of Britain's film industry.
For Rank, the very embodiment of the Victorian industrialist, the film industry was just that, an industry.
Rank saw culture as a commodity like any other, something that was manufactured, packaged and sold. His mills may have fed the nation, but he dreamed of giving people cultural sustenance, something to lift up their hearts and elevate their minds.
But there was an obstacle in the way of Rank's dream, and that obstacle was America. Before the Second World War, American films accounted for 80% of British screen time, earning $50 million a year from British cinema goers. But this wasn't just about the money.
In the summer of 1945, the head of Britain's new Arts Council, the economist John Maynard Keynes, made a radio address to the nation. And in it, he made no bones about his underlying ambitions.
Let every part of merry England be merry in its own way. Death to Hollywood.
Death to Hollywood. For people like Keynes, Britain's youngsters weren't just talking American.
If you think you're going to make a plowjacky out of me, you got another thing coming.
They were dressing American, walking American, even thinking American. And all this raised the ghastly prospect that very soon we would merely be a remote colonial outpost of a great American cultural empire.
Rank fervently believed that Britain had everything it needed to take on Hollywood and reassert good old British values. And at the end of the war, he proved it. In 1944, Rank brought Laurence Olivier's Henry V to the screen in glorious Technicolor.
Once more, unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close them all up with our English dead.
The story goes that Henry V was commissioned by Winston Churchill as a way of rallying the nation's morale for the long struggle against the Nazis. But the film also chimed perfectly with Rank's dream of packaging and selling patriotic high culture for a mass audience. And what better way to take on Hollywood than with the help of England's greatest playwright and Britain's finest actor?
And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear.
Henry V took the American box office by storm.
There is none of you so mean and base that hath of noble.
Time magazine called it one of the great experiences in the history of motion pictures.
The game's afoot. follow your spirit, and upon this charge strike on for Harry, England and St. George!
This could have been Rank's own rallying cry, and it inspired some remarkably bull-headed rhetoric.
Another warmly appreciated speech came from that champion of British films, Mr. Rank.
As an exhibitor, I know today that you can make more money out of British pictures than any other pictures.
Strong words indeed, but Rank was convinced that the formula for success was to establish a quintessentially British brand, one which relied on British talent, British heritage, and British history. And in the late 1940s, he bankrolled some of the greatest films ever made, from The Red Shoes and Great Expectations to A Matter of Life and Death.
But it is in connection with a film organisation employing over 32,000 men and women that the name of J. Arthur Rank has achieved worldwide recognition, carrying the name of Britain to the farthest corners of the earth through the medium of British film.
But despite his successes, Rank himself never seemed entirely comfortable in the film world.
Even when Rank went to Hollywood, he remained very much the stoical Victorian industrialist. At one press conference in 1947, an American reporter was so frustrated by Rank's silence that he asked him, "Is it true, Mr. Rank, that you are dumb?" And there was a long pause. And then Rank said, "No, just dull."
Sadly, for all his efforts, this God-fearing Yorkshireman just couldn't compete with the vast Hollywood machine. But what he created was a formula that became one of the great mainstays of our post-war culture.
Above all, Rank had discovered that on the cultural front, Britishness and British history were our greatest assets. This would become our brand, and in the long run, it would fundamentally change not just how other people thought about us, but how we thought about ourselves.
This is BBC Television. It's 1 o'clock.
In 1964, the BBC's flagship sports programme Grandstand featured a rather unusual item.
Now, in just a few minutes, a Boeing 707 was due to arrive from New York, and carrying in it 4 remarkable young men from Liverpool. And this is the moment they've been waiting for. Paul McCartney leading them off, George Harrison on the left, John Lennon, and then Ringo Starr.
The Beatles were back from America, an international sensation.
But we told you you've come back from America millionaires.
I'll buy you a drink.
But perhaps the way to understand the Beatles is not just as a band whose music has become the soundtrack to our lives, but as a business proposition. For all the vigour and freshness of the songwriting, the Beatles were an immaculately packaged product. And for that, they had one man in particular to thank.
Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. Artists credit him with a unique judgment of what will be a hit and who will make it. Nearly all of them earn more than the Prime Minister.
Brian Epstein has become a near legendary figure, a Liverpool businessman who discovered the Beatles at the Cavern Club in 1961 and managed them until his early death in 1967.
I hadn't had anything to do with management of pop artists before that day that I went down to the Cavern Club and heard the Beatles playing.
Having grown up working for his parents' furniture business, Epstein knew a thing or two about selling, and he knew exactly how he wanted to package the band.
The Beatles were then just 4 lads on that rather dimly lit stage, somewhat ill-clad, and the presentation was, well, left little to be desired as far as I was concerned.
One of the first things that Brian Epstein did was to bring the Beatles to Liverpool's finest tailor. And there he replaced their black leather jackets with smart, dark suits. In essence, Epstein had turned them into the kind of band that your mother would approve of. But he was also making them a band, or a brand, that was quintessentially British. No longer did the Beatles look like 1950s American rockers. Now they projected a kind of sanitized, exaggerated Britishness.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night, I should be sleeping like a log. But when I get home to you, I find the things that you do will make me feel alright.
And it wasn't just the suits. The Beatles were cheeky and irreverent. Lovable Liverpool jesters, not just serious musicians.
Well, you don't interview the Beatles, you just play straight man.
For an American audience, they'd seen something entirely new. Very quickly, Epstein's boys were generating enormous international sales. It made a rather refreshing change.
By the early 1960s, the world was turning its back on British exports. But the Beatles were bucking the trend. By 1967, they were making £20 million worth of export business from the United States alone.
George, how do you like being described as the Prime Minister's secret weapon?
It's great, yeah. The thing is, I didn't get the bit where they said, earning all these dollars for Britain, or like, are we sharing it out or something?
The truth was, they were the Prime Minister's secret weapon. And in 1965, Downing Street showed its appreciation in a very public fashion.
So came the summons to the palace. The news got round to the faithful that the world's #1 group were to be invested by Her Majesty with the most excellent order of the British Empire.
But their MBEs weren't for music. The press claimed they were for money, for services to exports.
Baby's good to me, you know she's happy as can be, you know she said so. I'm in love with her and I feel fine.
This was an extraordinary moment. Today we take it for granted that pop stars and celebrities will be awarded MBEs almost every year. But in 1965, the Beatles Award felt genuinely shocking. For the first time, Britain's political establishment had recognised and rewarded pop cultural capital.
Why is the MBE awarded though? I don't know.
No idea.
In fact, I know nothing about it. It's just that we've got it, and it's nice to have, and it doesn't make you more respectable or anything, I don't think. Maybe other people think it does. It doesn't make me any more respectable. I'm still a scruff.
The Beatles had been clutched to the bosom of the British establishment, and not everyone was happy about it. The pages of the Times simmered with outrage. For the next war, wrote one man, do not count on me, use the Beatles or the Beatniks.
But amid all the invective, some correspondents grasped the deeper issues. Sir, may I list a few of the reasons why many people think the national recognition of the Beatles quite appropriate? 1. They are significant earners of foreign exchange. 2. They have, to quote Mr. Heath when he was president of the Board of Trade, saved the British corduroy industry. 3. They have helped to correct the foreign vision of Britain as a country entirely populated by middle-class conservatives of all sorts, e.g. stockbrokers, wildcat strikers, beef-eaters, and Pembrokeshire coracle fishermen.
By now, Britain's sense of its own identity seemed in flux. With our empire gone and our industry dying, here was a new role: entertainers to the world. Every cultural revolution needs its founding texts. Preserved here in the Bodleian Library in Oxford is a document that arguably shaped modern Britain every bit as much as, well, the Magna Carta.
This is the very first Sunday Times colour section from the 4th of February 1962. Now today every Sunday paper has a colour supplement, but at the time this represented something thrillingly new. A glossy colour magazine carefully targeted at young, affluent and often female readers. So this very first cover features the model of the moment, Jean Shrimpton.
Just your eyes, I'm interested in that. Well, no one told me about her.
Wearing clothes by Mary Quant, photographed by David Bailey.
Make that, let me, no, don't move.
And there's even the promise of a new James Bond story by Ian Fleming himself. Something for everyone.
Why should I care?
And everyone, it seemed, rather liked it.
She's not there. Well, let me tell you about
Within 9 months, the Sunday Times had 200,000 extra readers. And by 1964, the Sunday Telegraph and the Observer had launched colour supplements of their own.
And in these glossy pages, you could read about the latest British fashions, the latest British film stars, the latest British pop groups. Aspirational, materialistic and heavily funded by advertising, these glossy magazines played a central role in creating the idea of the swinging 60s, and more specifically, of swinging London.
They seek him here, they seek him there. His clothes are loud, but never square.
If you read enough of these magazines, you might imagine that London was a buzzing technicolor metropolis.
'Cause he's a dedicated follower of fashion.
A city inhabited solely by artists, pop stars and models.
Round the boutiques of London town,
But in truth, it wasn't quite like that.
pursuing all the latest fads and trends. 'Cause he's a dedicated follower of fashion.
In 1968, almost a quarter of London's households were living in poverty. This was still, above all, a working industrial city.
In reality, the 60s only swung for a tiny minority. Of course, life was getting better, but even here in London, that was more a question of cars, fridges and washing machines than of free love and flower power. Less Magical Mystery Tour, more Coronation Street. But in a sense, that didn't really matter. Swinging London was about the triumph of image. And this was the key moment when Britain's image changed from grey industrial powerhouse to technicolor global entertainers.
Swinging London may have been little more than a branding exercise to disguise our post-war decline, but it worked. What it created was a new image of Britain, both at home and abroad, an image of London as the capital of culture and of Britain, once again, as a place of consequence.
The swinging London phenomenon reached its peak with this, the April 1966 edition of the American magazine Time. Inside, in admittedly fairly excruciating prose, the magazine painted a picture of a city devoted to high fashion, pop culture, and the pursuit of pleasure. Here's an extract. This spring, as never before in modern times, London is switched on. The city is alive with birds, girls, and beetles, buzzing with mini-cars and telestars, pulsing with half a dozen separate veins of excitement.
The tourists came in their droves. In 1960, some 1.5 million people had visited London, but by the mid-60s, that figure was more like 6 million. And London was now exporting the idea of its swinging scene all over the world.
Caracas, the swinging city of Venezuela. The Centro Comercial Chacapio building is the place for mod gear. The influence is definitely Carnaby Street. Boutiques abound, crammed with face-setting copper, hot from the fashion centre in London, W1.
Only a few years earlier, Britain had still been one of the world's great exporters of steel and ships. Now we were selling fashion and music. And like our old industrial exports, these things were often made in our manufacturing heartlands and brought to London before being sold abroad. Victorian London had been the world's capital of money, but 60s London saw itself as the capital of culture.
But for one young entrepreneur, it was precisely our Victorian legacy that offered the greatest cultural possibilities. After all, Britain still had a rich network of global connections, the threads of empire. And while his predecessors had been trading slaves and sugar, his chosen commodity was culture.
Keep on running. Keep on hiding. One day I'm gonna be the one to make you understand.
In the early 1960s, this corner of West London, then neglected and shabby, was home to much of the city's growing West Indian community.
The spectacle of a 25-year-old former public schoolboy driving around these streets in a Mini Cooper might have seemed a bit incongruous. But the man in the Mini was one of the most remarkable cultural entrepreneurs in our modern history. His name was Chris Blackwell, and he'd grown up in Jamaica and fallen in love with the local music. And he was here in London to sell ska music to the Jamaican immigrant community. And he kept the records in the boot.
Like all great entrepreneurs, Blackwell had identified a market.
Any moment now, there's going to be a serious outbreak of ska. And ska is the new beat from the West Indies, from Jamaica.
Where the Victorians had imported Jamaican sugar, Chris Blackwell was going to import Jamaican music. And he did so with remarkable success.
Daylight come and I want to go home, but all they want to do is ska.
His first hit came from the 17-year-old Millie Small with the single My Boy Lollipop. Blackwell's label, Island Records, quickly became one of the most exciting around, with a remarkable roster of talent. But Blackwell always dreamed of propelling Jamaican music into the mainstream, and in the early 1970s, he got his chance.
By 1970, Blackwell had set up a recording studio here at Basing Street, West London. This room, believe it or not, was his office. And it was through that door that in 1972, Bob Marley and the Wailers came strolling in for their first meeting with the man who would make them famous. They made such an impression that Blackwell gave them £4,000 then and there to go away and make a record. Now, some of his friends were worried that he'd never see their money or indeed the band ever again, but Blackwell's hunch would pay handsome dividends.
A couple of months later, Blackwell was invited to the studio to hear what would become Marley's first album for Ireland, Catch a Fire.
Up until this point, reggae was still very much a minority interest, but Blackwell was convinced that Bob Marley could take it into the musical mainstream. To do that, though, Blackwell felt they needed to make the music more accessible for a British audience. So he deliberately toned down the frenetic reggae style. He introduced more guitars and more synthesizers. He even expanded the solos. And the result was one of the most influential records in rock music history.
Catch a Fire was released to enormous acclaim. It kick-started Marley's career. But Blackwell had one more trick up his sleeve.
Chris Blackwell always had a real flair for marketing, and in particular he was a great believer in packaging. If people thought something looked good on the outside, he once said, then they would naturally assume there must be something good on the inside. And that's certainly true of Catch a Fire. So the album is designed like a Zippo lighter. You flick it open, you get the fire, and ultimately the vinyl. To be completely honest, it is actually a bit of a hassle getting the record in and out, but that I suppose is beside the point, because in the early 1970s this seemed like a thing of beauty, and let's be honest, it is a lot better looking than an iTunes download.
The combination of Bob Marley's talent and charisma and Chris Blackwell's entrepreneurial nous turned the reggae artist into a global superstar.
Island Records have invested several $100,000 in Bob Marley and the Wailers, and the dividend just keeps on increasing.
Legend, The Best of Bob Marley, went on to sell 25 million copies, becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time.
Reggae is now firmly established as a highly marketable commodity heard throughout the world, perhaps the only really new sound of the 70s.
All this could, I think, only have happened in Britain. You see, in essence, what Blackwell was doing was capitalising on the long-established relationship between the imperial metropolis, London, and its former colony, Jamaica. Only this time, the key commodity wasn't sugar, it was music. Whatever you might think of the empire, the fact is that it left Britain at the centre of a dense web of cultural and economic connections. And it was this network that Blackwell used to bring reggae to a global audience. The influence of reggae can still be heard to this day.
and the deeper tones of Jamaican dub and dancehall have inspired British music movements from drum and bass to dubstep and grime.
Look at me up in the cheeky booth, man. Look up with the drama, all we started. Now I'm in here laying on my back, singing DJ.
But of course, not everybody's musical tastes are quite so cool and urban.
When we think about the music of the 60s and 70s, we often think about the big names. People like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, David Bowie and the Sex Pistols. But the reality was a bit more surprising. The best-selling act of the 1960s, for example, wasn't the Beatles. It was Soundtrack, featuring original cast.
Drops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with strings. These are a few of my favourite things.
Pop bands might have thrilled the kids, but they barely touched the unassailable popularity of the musical. By 1975, The Sound of Music soundtrack had outsold the Beatles' best-selling album Abbey Road by a ratio of almost 2 to 1.
Girls in white dresses with blue satin sashes.
In the 50s and 60s, musical theatre was dominated by Broadway. But by the 1970s, there was a new kid on the block, and he was British.
On the 9th of October 1986, Her Majesty's Theatre, here in London's Haymarket, was the venue for the gala opening of the most anticipated new show in the West End. This was the first night of Andrew Lloyd Webber's The Phantom of the Opera, the hottest ticket in town. The story goes that the composer himself was a bag of nerves, and at the interval, he and the show's producer, Cameron McIntosh, headed off to a local bar for a few stiff drinks. They didn't even make it back in time for the curtain call, but they needn't have worried, because as the last note died away, there was a 10-minute standing ovation. And the Phantom of the Opera has been playing at this theatre continuously ever since.
Andrew Lloyd Webber had made his name in the 1970s with a string of hits, from Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat to Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita. In 1981, Cats opened in the West End, where it ran for 21 years. But The Phantom of the Opera took Lloyd Webber's star to unprecedented heights, becoming the most financially successful entertainment event in history.
For me, Andrew Lloyd Webber's great skill lies in his ability to take an apparently forbidding subject and then apply a liberal sprinkling of stardust. Over the years, he's taken the book of Genesis, the story of Jesus, the life of Eva Peron, the poetry of T.S. Eliot, and in the case of Phantom, a half-forgotten Victorian horror story by the French writer Gaston Leroux, and he has turned each of them into a foot-stamping, hand-clapping, crowd-pleasing spectacle. And what could be more Victorian than broadening the minds of the great British public with a heady mixture of high culture and pure populism?
Like all good populists, Lloyd Webber had a very canny approach to marketing. Keen to test the waters for his latest venture, he released the title track as a single 9 months before the show opened. Sung by Sarah Brightman and Steve Harley, the former Cockney rebel. He went straight in to the top 10.
Give your love to me, for love is blind. The Phantom of the Opera is
Somehow it feels supremely fitting that Andrew Lloyd Webber's most successful musical is set in a 19th century opera house. Because to me, he feels like a very Victorian figure. He combines so many familiar roles: the theatrical impresario, the canny entrepreneur, the ambitious businessman, the civic philanthropist, the capitalist empire builder, all of them underpinned by the same combination of cultural uplift and commercial self-interest.
Thanks to Lloyd Webber, musical theatre became the hottest ticket on Broadway and one of Britain's biggest cultural exports of the entire 1980s. And London's West End became a tourist honeypot, up there with Buckingham Palace and the Tower of London. As one cultural grandee put it, the arts are to British tourism what the sun is to Spain. By the end of the decade, Lloyd Webber himself had become a multi-million-pound global brand.
Only today we read that you insured yourself for £10 million. I know you hate to talk about money, but why did you have to do that?
Well, I'm surprised to read that. A bit saddened, really, because the last time I picked up a paper, I thought I was worth 300 million. I seem to have come down in price. It's terrible.
1986 didn't just mark the launch of Phantom. It was also the year that Lloyd Webber's company, the Really Useful Group, floated on the London Stock Exchange. His music was now a commodity, bought and sold all over the world. As Lloyd Webber well knew, in a society where the market rules, if you get the sales pitch right, then everything has its price. The Shark Tank at the aquarium in London's County Hall, probably their biggest attraction.
But the most famous shark to take up residence in this building was rather less animated. It was in fact pickled.
This tiger shark is officially known as the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living, by the artist Damien Hirst. In 2003, it went on display in a new gallery on the ground floor of County Hall. And it became perhaps the best-known work of British art in the last 40 years. It was commissioned by the advertising executive turned modern art Svengali, Charles Saatchi.
By the early 1990s, Saatchi had become the single most important patron of the group known as the YBAs, the Young British Artists. For the YBAs, the really important thing was the idea. They were interested less in technical skill than in provocative, even inflammatory imagery. The YBAs gloried in arresting images designed to shock. Dismembered livestock, phallic foodstuffs, portraits of serial killers made with children's handprints, grotesque dolls, the triumph of the startling, shocking image. As Saatchi himself put it, they made art that was head-buttingly impossible to ignore.
It was little wonder they appealed to a former ad man. Indeed, Saatchi's forays into modern art were only possible because of his phenomenal success in the world of advertising. In the 70s and 80s, he'd been involved with some of the most memorable TV ads ever made. With the fortune that he'd built selling brands, Saatchi came to dominate the contemporary art market. The art may have been modern, but his motives were very familiar.
Charles Saatchi was not, of course, the first self-made man to spend his winnings on contemporary art. Exactly a century earlier, in the 1890s, the Victorian sugar magnate Sir Henry Tate had given his own substantial contemporary art collection to the nation. He even paid for a special gallery in which to house it, the Tate. For Tate, and I suspect for Saatchi, art meant status. So it was that Saatchi took to visiting degree shows like this one. Indeed, on occasion, he would actually buy up entire degree shows.
By the mid-90s, Saatchi's patronage had turned his iconoclastic protégés into household names. Suddenly, British art seemed the most controversial and exciting in the world.
Young artists all over Britain who are producing work that is challenging, articulate and relevant. Now, sometimes that work appears tasteless and cynical and uncouth. I think it's because sometimes we all are.
But Charles Saatchi did more than just buy art and show it off or store it away. He sold it on, creating a churn of speculation that increased the value of his holdings and created a boom in the market.
YBAs emerged out of a very distinctive historical moment. Margaret Thatcher's election hat-trick had seemed to mark the definitive triumph of market forces.
It is wonderful to be entrusted with the government of this country, this great country, once again.
Saatchi himself had played a pivotal role in Mrs. Thatcher's success. His advertising agency had been behind some of the Conservatives' most eye-catching campaign publicity. And he strode into the world of art at the high watermark of Thatcherism. What Saatchi understood was that the YBA's provocative, attention-seeking images were the perfect products for an age of conspicuous consumption.
Charles Saatchi and the YBAs took the idea of cultural capital to extraordinary new heights. This was art for the age of money, made by a new generation who were all too conscious of their new earning power.
Even the artists themselves sometimes recognized the absurdity of their inflated price tags.
How did the Damien Hirst ashtray come about?
Me and Sarah started smoking quite violently. No, I will smoke quite violently, but you started. I started smoking violently with this fantastic ashtray full of dog ends, and Sarah said, "Look, it's Damien Hirst." And I said, "It is Damien Hirst." We just got a photocopy done, stuck it on the bottom, sold it for tons of money.
And what of the man on the bottom of the ashtray? Damien Hirst, whose pickled shark Charles Saatchi had commissioned, became the poster boy of the YBAs.
So how do you feel?
Good. Beautiful. Sexy. How do you feel?
Hirst's art was an exercise in rampant commercialism. From a bull with horns and hooves cast in 18-karat gold, to a human skull covered with £15 million worth of diamonds. And to a canny businessman, intellectual property was everything. When the skull went on sale, the only images available were those provided by Hirst himself. In 2011, Hirst even gave classes in spin painting for the bankers and business giants at the Global Economic Forum at Davos. But by then this didn't seem odd. It seemed in fact like a typical British success story.
love others good.
Most people could never afford to buy a Damien Hirst, but they could afford the other great British success story of the day. And this was something based on the same spirit of technological innovation that had defined Britain's Victorian heyday. After all, the children of the 80s didn't just grow up with Thatcherism. They had something entirely new: the home computer.
This was, I suppose, a new industrial revolution, almost mind-boggling, not just in the pace of technological change, but in its impact on our day-to-day lives. Now, at the time, there was an awful lot of talk about the potential for education and business. But for a generation of self-taught teenage programmers, the machine's real potential lay in something altogether more fun: games.
For a brief moment in the 1980s, home computers seemed an open market, a free-for-all which saw a new breed of cultural entrepreneur emerge blinking into the daylight, well, or the glare of the television studio.
Are they difficult to do? Difficult to play?
No, not really. Playing, it's just to get people used to the computer. To write them, it's difficult at first, but when you get the hang of it, it's fine.
Now, what's happening here?
Well, you're controlling a car. It's a racetrack.
Then you've crashed.
Yes.
Tell you something, you can't play with that and talk at the same time, can you?
No, it's difficult.
It's difficult.
But there was one game produced by two Cambridge undergraduates, David Braben and Ian Bell, which changed everything.
We were writing for ourselves in that we did what we wanted to do and not what we thought would sell to a certain extent. But we always had the idea of writing a good selling game.
And that they did.
Will you become one of the elite? The space combateers, set apart by their total mastery of the spaceway.
Only players who successfully piloted their armed Cobra spacecraft around a universe of 2,000 planets in 8 galaxies, profitably trading commodities and fighting off space pirates as they go, qualify to join the elite.
I was 10 years old when Elite came out, and it took over my life. I spent months playing this game, many of them admittedly waiting for it to load. Of course, by today's standards, it all looks pretty basic, but at the time, these simple wireframe graphics represented a revolution.
Elite was something entirely new. This wasn't a 3-minute arcade game, it was an epic, presenting players with a seemingly endless universe to explore on their own terms. You could run guns, traffic drugs, and vaporize whomever you liked. Your decisions had consequences, but they were your decisions. Braben and Bell had turned computer games into mainstream culture. This was an immersive, open-ended world which drew heavily on science fiction.
David Braben and Ian Bell were barely into their 20s when Elite came out, and they represented a new kind of cultural hero, the geeky genius.
Really started off as a hobby. I think it still is really a hobby, but obviously it's changed slightly.
But on the other hand, it's quite profitable in the long run.
Yes.
Elite was also very much a product of the Thatcherite 80s, a fact reinforced by its mercenary ethos: trade, fight, and pillage your way to the top in order to become elite. But I think it also represented a much older sensibility, the kind of individual drive and technological ambition that had led Richard Arkwright to develop his spinning frame, or Boulton and Watt to pioneer the steam engine.
this entrepreneurial strategy would pay handsome dividends. In the last 30 years, video games have been the fastest growing cultural commodity in the world. Elevated from children's entertainment to multi-million pound blockbusters. From Elite's rather basic beginnings have grown this, the fastest selling entertainment product in history. Grand Theft Auto looks American. It sounds American. It has a distinctly American attitude to firearms, but it's actually British. Made in Scotland and based on the very same free-roaming concept as Elite. The latest version earned $1 billion in its first 3 days. When we think of the Victorians, we remember an extraordinary generation who built our world in bricks and mortar, glass and steel, and I think their spirit still endures. You know, we love to run ourselves down, but our popular culture, fueled by exactly the same ambition and inventiveness that drove the Victorians, is simply second to none. We may no longer be the workshop of the world, turning out ships and steel, but we do still make one thing better than anybody else. We make stories. Next time, some of our culture's favourite subjects. Very rich people, very posh people, and very large houses.